Transcendental philosophy has the advantage, and moreover the duty, of searching for its conceptions according to a principle, because these conceptions spring pure and unmixed out of the understanding as an absolute unity, and therefore must be connected with each other according to one conception or idea. A connection of this kind, however, furnishes us with a ready prepared rule, by which its proper place may be assigned to every pure conception of the understanding, and the completeness of the system of all be determined a priori, both of which would otherwise have been dependent on mere choice or chance. Immanuel Kant. In my last lecture, I explained the table of categories. Kant says that there are 12 pure intellectual concepts, so concepts, sorts of things that we don't take out of experience. So we do acquire them by making experience, by reflecting on that process, by reflecting on what our intellect is doing when connecting perceptions and thereby making experience out of them. But we don't take these concepts out of experience. Rather, we need them to make experience. They are conditions of the possibility of experience. And there are 12 basic pure intellectual concepts, which Kant, with the old Aristotelian name, calls categories, and describes in his table of categories, which I explained once again in the previous lecture. But in that lecture, I only talked about the actual table of categories, and I explained each individual category and what Kant means by them. Now I want to sort of take a step back and look at the whole of the table of categories and talk about what it means, how Kant gets there, and what its importance is for Kant. Well, first of all, someone might ask, how does Kant get to these 12 categories? Because the claim is that Kant is making that unlike Aristotle, who also tried finding the basic categories of our thinking, unlike Aristotle, Kant actually found the true categories and actually gave a complete list of all the basic concepts our thinking is based on. The issue with Aristotle was that he sought his categories empirically. So he just thought about it, he just looked around and tried to find the basic concepts in thinking that we use. If you do it like that, there's always the possibility that you are overlooking something, that you are forgetting something, or that you are thinking something is a category which in truth isn't. The issue with this empirical approach is you never know when you are done. What Kant is claiming, because he is not an empiricist, he is a rationalist, his approach is an a priori approach. What he is claiming is that his table of categories, that's it. There can't be any more or any less. We know that this is complete. And that is exactly because he deduced it a priori. But then, how does he get to these 12 categories? Why 12? Why not 10 or 13? You might ask this especially if you have listened to my previous lecture on what is science to Kant. Because there, I said that all division, and clearly this table of categories is a division into 12 parts, right? We have the, you could say, the 13th, or you could also say the 0th category of connection, I talked about that in the last lecture. So basically all that thinking is an act of synthesizing, and therefore when the intellect reflects on its own action of synthesizing, of connecting, then it will get the concept of a connection. That is basically our only pure intellectual concept, which then is split into 12 different concepts, into the 12 categories, because there are 12 ways in which we do connect. But anyways, in the lecture on what is science to Kant, I said that all divisions, according to Kant, must either be empirical divisions, which lead to polytomies, so divisions into many parts, no matter if it's 3 or 300, or they are logical divisions, according to the principle of contradiction, and those can only lead to dichotomies, so divisions into two, because you only split a concept into one concept and its opposite, A and non-A. So this, we have 12 categories, seems to be not a dichotomy, not a division into two. Therefore, since it seems to be a polytomy, one could assume that it's empirical. But once again, Kant says it is not empirical. And he says that this is why his table of categories is better than what Aristotle did, because it's not empirical. How does this make sense? Well, first of all, the question should not be why 12 categories. It should be why 12 judgments. Because as I explained in the previous lecture on how we get our concepts and how Kant reconciled empiricism with rationalism, really what Kant is saying is that the 12 categories are derived from the 12 judgments. What Kant is saying is our intellect can connect things in 12 different ways, and if it reflects on these 12 different ways, it derives at 12 different categories. But then, why these 12 different judgments, you asked? Well, in fact, there is a logical division in play here, I would say. And I would say, because, and this is certainly a weakness of the critique of pure reason, Kant actually doesn't really explain this. He explains that he derives the categories from the 12 judgments, but the table of judgments he sort of just gives without further explanation how he got there. So this was not really satisfying for philosophers that came after him, like Fichte or Hegel. But we can try to interpret Kant here without going into what these later philosophers had to say about it. And we can try to think about what his deal might have been, and how within the framework of Kant's philosophy we can explain these 12 types of judgment. And well, in fact, I think there is a logical division in play here, because remember that the table of categories, or the table of judgments, is made up of two classes, the mathematic and the dynamic class. So we do start out with a dichotomy. We have, in fact, at first the concept of connection as such, and now we can make the logical division into A and non-A, into two opposites. That is, the mathematic connections of things of the same kind, and the dynamic connections of things that are not of the same kind. And then, after that, there is in fact a second logical division happening, because both of those classes, once again, have two titles under them. So when it comes to the mathematical connections that connect things of the same kind, those can either be connections of quantity, where you have, as Kant put it, one thing in many things. I explained that further in the previous lecture. So, for example, one concept of treeness in the many trees of a forest, and these many trees, they are of the same kind, they are all trees, they are connected as a quantity to form one forest. Or you have the categories of quality, where you have many things in one. For example, many degrees of temperature in one cup of water, or many kilos in one stone. So these degrees of a quantity, they are coming together in one thing, being connected in one thing, and they once again are of the same kind. And within the dynamic class of categories, you have the logical division into the categories of relation, that connect things of a different kind, insofar as they are dependent on one another for their existence. Right? So red depends on the rose for its existence. The melting of ice depends on the heat of the sun for its existence. The heart as a part depends on the body as the whole for its existence. Or you have, in the categories of modality, a connection of various different attributes, of various different things, in my thinking as belonging to one experience or not belonging to one experience. So the two classes and the four titles of categories, I would say we can get to them with simply a logical division. And as a side note, Fichte would later find out that all thinking happens within a framework of fivefoldness. And I would say that here you can find this fivefoldness, because Fichte always says that in this fivefoldness, one part is sort of the connecting middle part, and then it connects two pairs, each of them having two parts. And that's exactly what we have here, right? So we have the main concept, which not itself is depicted in the table of categories, but from which it is derived. That is the concept of connection. And then this concept is divided into two pairs of connections of things of one kind and of things of different kinds, which in turn are both divided into two kinds: quantity and quality, and relation and modality. So Kant didn't yet discover this fivefoldness, but clearly it was already there in his thinking. And I mean, that should be the case if Fichte is right? Because he's saying this fivefoldness is not just something that he, Fichte, happens to base his thinking on, but rather he's saying that all human thinking, and that would imply also all philosophy and also all the thinking of Kant, follows this fivefold structure. And he, Fichte, is just the one who discovered it, like the one who discovered the flow of blood in our body was not himself the first person who had blood flowing through his body, but rather the circulation of blood has been true for all human beings since the Stone Age. And I mean, this is exactly what philosophy does. I already talked about this in the previous lectures on what is philosophy, what is metaphysics to Kant. This is also what Kant says about philosophy. It doesn't bring new discoveries like the empirical science, like the natural science does. Rather, it brings more clarity. It makes us become clear about and aware of things that have always, at least unconsciously, been there in everyone's thinking. But anyways, back to Kant. So this basic structure of the table of categories can be derived at through logical division. But how about the actual categories? Because, okay, so far we divided into two, and then we divided both parts into two again. But now it seems we are dividing into three, right? Each of the four titles of categories contains three categories, not just two. Well, here I must add to what I said previously, and I already alluded to that in the lecture on what is science to Kant. Kant says there is in fact a third type of division. There is the empirical division, dividing into many parts, and the logical division, dividing into two opposing and contradicting parts. But there's also what could be called the metaphysical division. And this, in fact, leads to a trichotomy, Kant says, so to three parts. And this is, therefore, clearly what seems to be at play here. And this kind of division into three parts is, in fact, very important within Kant's philosophy. Not just here in the table of categories, but also, for example, in his philosophy of justice, in his political philosophy, where he has the classical three powers of the state, legislative, executive, and judicative powers. Or, for example, in his philosophy of religion, where he divides the idea of God into three ideas, and well, that is basically the classical Trinity, so with a moral spin. I will talk about that when I get to these parts of Kant's philosophy. I just here want to point out that this threefold structure is very important in Kant's thinking. But how does he get to three parts? Why three? Well, this kind of division, this metaphysical kind of division, it is also a priori, just like the logical division. But it is not merely analytic, like the logical division, which just works with the principle of contradiction, and that is how analytic judgments work, according to Kant. They just apply the principle of contradiction and analyze a concept and find out what contradicts that concept. No, these kinds of divisions into three, they are synthetic, in fact, because they are based on a logical division into two parts, but then the third part they arrive at by combining these two contradicting parts into that third. And if you reflect a bit on this table of categories, you will find that this is exactly what's happening. You will find that in each of the four titles, the first two categories are sort of opposing contradictions, while the third one combines them both. So when you look at the categories of quantity, you have unity and multiplicity. Well, clearly, multiplicity is the opposing concept to unity. Having many is the opposite of having just one. Also, at the same time, you can say that this second category is based sort of on the first one, because you can't have many without having the concept of one, because many are just many ones, right? So in a forest, you have many trees. That means you first need to have singular trees. Well, and then the third category of quantity, that is universality, not the one, not the many, but the all. Clearly, that is, on the one hand, a multiplicity, right? All contains more than just one thing, it contains many things. But at the same time, it is a sort of unity, because by saying we have all, you are saying that this multiplicity is a one, forms a unit. The same is true when you look at the categories of quality. You first have the category of reality, so saying that something is there, a positive category. And then you have, on the other hand, the category of negation, which obviously is the opposite of reality, saying that something is not there. And also, once again, it is based on that first category. It needs the first category to be possible. I talked about this previously. You can only negate what is there, what you know. You can only, therefore, Kant would say, know what darkness is if you know the light. The blind person, Kant says, doesn't really have a concept of darkness. You can only know the cold if you know the heat. You can, Kant says, only really know poverty if you know richness. So therefore, Kant says the savage, who may live a very simple life, who may wear almost nothing, who may not have a house of his own, who may own no things, he doesn't feel like he's poor, because he doesn't know what wealth and richness is. And likewise, Kant would say that you can only know ignorance when you know knowledge, when you know science. And this, of course, is an old thought, that you have to know many, many things to understand how little you really know. This is, of course, the problem behind what is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So people who are ignorant or who are incompetent, they will not realize this. They will believe to know better than they actually do, because they lack the knowledge or the understanding to realize that they don't know. Well, and then third, you have the concept of limitation, which is obviously a combination of reality and negation. It is reality, but not a full unlimited reality, but rather a reality that is partially negated, that is limited by non-reality, by negation. Now, if we turn to relation, we have first the category of substance and accidents. So a relation of a thing not with another thing, but with itself, with its own attribute. And then you have the category of causality, which is sort of the opposite of that, because here it is not about inherence, about that which is related to the thing being inherent, being inside that thing, but rather it is outside of that thing. This is the relation between two different things, two different substances, which are outside of each other, which are in a way independent of each other, but still one is having an effect on the other. And again, this second category depends on the first one. You can't have causality without first having substance and accidents, because otherwise, what would be the cause of what? after all, it has to be two substances where one causes the other, or rather causes a change in the other's accidents. Well, and then third, you have the category of community, or of the whole and the parts, where you combine once again the first two categories, because you do have, just like in causality, you do have various substances that as substances are sort of standing on their own independently of each other, but at the same time you also have, like in the first category, this quality of inherence. You have these various substances being inherent in one and the same whole, of which they are parts. And then in the group of modality, you have at first mere possibility, and then second, you have existence, which on the one hand is the opposite of mere possibility, right? But on the other hand, it actually is dependent on possibility, because how could something actually exist, without first its existence being possible? Well, and the third category here, necessity, is once more is a combination of the other two, because necessity is something that exists simply by being possible. Here you don't have first possibility and then need a reason for the merely possible being actualized into existence, but rather just by being possible, the necessary thing already exists. The existence is contained within the possibility, so to say. Or you could define it the other way around. You could say the necessary is that whose non-existence is impossible. So you see that in each of these four groups, the third category is derived from the first two categories getting combined. However, I do need to stress, and this is very important for Kant, this does not mean that the third category is somehow just that, just a combination of the first two. Because then it wouldn't be justified to be part of the table of categories. Then it would not be a basic element of our thinking, but rather something derived from the basic elements, right? But what Kant stresses is that this third concept, it is more than the sum of its parts. It's not just A plus non-A, but rather it really does contain a new element, and that is exactly the combination of the two parts and how the one is derived from the other. Let me explain that with the categories of modality. Necessity is not just possibility plus existence, because that would just be existence, right? The concept of existence is already existence plus possibility. Because everything that exists is also possible. It already contains possibility. Necessity is more than just possibility and existence. It is existence that comes from possibility. It is something that is not just possible and existing, but that is existing by being possible, simply because of being possible. So in that way, the third category really is something new, something third, a third element, and not just a combination of the first two. So you could say that the way Kant gets towards the categories, or towards the judgments from which he then deduces the categories, and the same which I just explained with the categories I could also explain with the judgments how the first two judgments combined always give you the third judgment. But to not make this long lecture even longer and to not bore you, I will not get into that. Instead, this could be an exercise for you if you want to go back to my previous lecture on the table of judgments, or just look at Kant's table of judgments. It should not be too hard, and it can also be an exercise that tells you if you have understood Kant so far or not. It should not be too hard to see how in each of the four groups the first two judgments together form the third one. But anyways, this seems to happen in the spirit of Kant's sympathetic method, which I already explained in its own lecture. This method, which is about when there are two opposing sides, not just throwing one side away, but rather trying to combine them into a third, into a middle way. This is what Kant always does. This is how he combines empiricism with dogmatic objective rationalism to get to subjective critical rationalism. We will see that when I go further into other parts of Kant's philosophy. This is how he always works. Always when there are two opposing sides, two opposing philosophical parties or opinions, he tries to find a middle path. And that same movement is happening here. And this has been very influential. We could, with the later name that Hegel would give to it, we could call it dialectic. There is this dialectical movement here of combining a thesis and an antithesis to form a synthesis. And that is the third category in each of the groups. At the same time, when you ask me how does Kant get to these three categories or three judgments in each group, I could also say that they are related to the three faculties of our thinking faculty. I already mentioned in my lecture on the apperception that the whole faculty of thinking, according to Kant, is made up of the intellect, the power of judgment, and reason. And if you know what these three are or what these three do, and unfortunately so far I have only talked about the intellect, so it's not quite clear yet to you maybe what the power of judgment and what reason do. I will only get into that in the next lectures. But maybe here it's enough to say that, well, the power of judgment is an applied intellect. So while the intellect is the faculty of rules or of concept, the power of judgment actually judges whether a rule is in place here or not. And reason as the faculty of principles, reason asks for conclusions, reason asks for completeness, reason wants totality, wants the absolute. Once again, I will explain both these faculties further in future lectures, but for my purpose here, this short explanation should be enough to realize that in each group, the first category corresponds to the intellect, the second to the power of judgment, and the third to reason. So if we look at quantity, once again, unity belongs to the intellect as faculty of concepts or rules, because that's what the intellect does. It thinks one. It thinks the unity of one rule. It thinks one concept. Here we can apply Leibniz's principle of the identity of the indistinguishable, right? I said that in previous lectures that within the realm of the intellect, within the realm of just thinking, not in sensuality, but in pure thinking, two identical concepts refer to the identical things. So if I think of a tree and then I think of a tree again, I've thought of the same thing. Two empirical trees that I perceive, one standing here, one standing there, they might be different, but just the concept of tree, what a tree is, with its definition, it is a plant, it has roots, it has leaves, and so on. I can repeat that a second time, and I've just repeated the same concept. So the intellect is about unity. Multiplicity doesn't exist in a way, you could say that doesn't exist for the intellect as such. Multiplicity is something you find in the world. It is something that requires a judgment. Your power of judgment needs to judge, well, here there's not just one, but this one repeats, so to say. I have many trees in this forest. I have many bricks in this wall. Well, and then, as I said, reason always wants the absolute. Reason wants totality. And that is exactly what the concept of universality is about, right? It is a totality of quantity. It is not just one thing or many things, but all the things. Likewise, when it comes to quality, reality belongs to the intellect. It is the intellect which thinks of an attribute as being there. Negation is not of the intellect as such. Rather, it requires a judgment. It requires a judgment. This reality, which I'm thinking, is not here. There is no light here, therefore there's darkness. There's no knowledge here, therefore there's ignorance. This already requires a judgment. And limitation, once again, corresponds to reason, because once again it is a sort of totality. Here we have all reality that there is, and this reality is enclosed by negation, by non-reality. Well, and if you look at relation, then once again you can say the intellect is thinking substance and accidents. Those are the basic components of our thinking, while causality, so saying that one substance somehow depends on the another substance, that requires the power of judgment. That requires you making a judgment about the world, examining things, examining their relations, and realizing there is a relation, there is a dependency here. And community is clearly a concept which corresponds to reason, because reason is the faculty of principles. It wants to deduce everything from one principle. Just like here in this category, we can deduce the various parts and their places within the whole from the concept of the whole. And this gives us a totality. Now we have all the parts combined in one whole. Well, and when it comes to modality, it is reason that can think possibility, because really possibility doesn't mean anything else but saying something doesn't contradict itself. It is possible to think this with the intellect being being the faculty of rules, can think this rule. So I can think of a unicorn, so the rule of a horse with a horn on its head, and there's no contradiction there, while I cannot think of a circle with angles or a four-angled triangle. They do contradict. This rule does contradict itself, and therefore it's not possible. This is also why any philosophy based solely on the principle of contradiction, which, as I said in the lecture on the table of judgments, also corresponds to this first category, or this first judgment, to the problematic judgments, the one on possibility. A philosophy based only on that, as the Leibniz-Wolffian school kind of was, that Kant's critique was criticizing, such a philosophy is only an intellectual philosophy, but not a truly rational philosophy, not a philosophy of reason, just of the intellect. And really, even if they thought they were doing more than that, they thought they were proving God or the immortality of the soul, they were only really dealing with formal possibility. All they were really showing was that their concepts of God, or their thoughts about the soul and the afterlife, were not impossible. They were not self-contradicting, but they were not really showing, even if they thought they were, that these things were actually real. But anyways, to say that something is not just possible but exists, the intellect is not enough. The intellect as such cannot recognize existence. It can only recognize possibility by recognizing that something can be thought without contradiction. To recognize existence, we need to make a judgment. And then lastly, necessity is very clearly a sort of absolute, a sort of totality. It is a sort of end. When something is just existing, I can always ask, why is it existing? And reason is not content with that. Because if a why is given, if a cause is given, I can again ask, why does this cause exist, however? And then I may be given a cause for the cause, but I can also again ask, why does it exist? But if I get told and explained, if that was possible, that some cause is necessary, so it doesn't require another cause through which it exists on its own simply by being necessary, then here I would have an end. Here I would have something absolute, and that is exactly what reason wants. So you could say that these three categories in every group, they correspond to the three faculties of our thinking faculty, which also might explain the phenomenon that unaufklärt people who may have intellect to some degree, who probably have the power of judgment less so, but who lack reason most of all, why they always have a harder time thinking the last category than thinking the first. You can always find that the more unaufklärt, the more unreasonable, the more irrational a person is, the harder they will find it to think universality or totality, the harder they will find it to think limitation, the harder they will find it to think true community, to think of the whole and the parts, the harder they will find it to think necessity. Those are thoughts that are sort of limited to the very rational, to the wise people, to the philosophers. But I want to make another remark, and that is that what you can find here is the greatest example for Kant's architectonic. I already gave a lecture on the architectonic as his scientific method, right? He says that a science should not be like a pile of sand, it should be like a pyramid or a proper house or an organic body. It should be systematic, meaning the parts should be derived from the idea of the whole and should be deduced from this idea of the whole, and should be necessary. And in that previous lecture, I could explain this in sort of general terms, but I could not yet give such a good example of what this means to Kant, because I had not yet explained the table of categories. But now that I have, I can say this is the core of Kant's architectonic, and here you can see it as at play. The 12 categories are not random, and it's not random that they form two classes of two groups of three categories, but rather this is necessary within Kant's system. And there's a sort of parallelism between the four groups, right? Again, always the first corresponds to the intellect, the second to the power of judgment, the third to reason. There's a sort of symmetry here. And this is also important, but unfortunately usually overlooked when you want to criticize Kant, because there have been many attempts, and especially nowadays, there are many attempts to do some small criticism on the table of categories. Like people are writing papers or dissertations on how in one of the four groups the Kant was wrong, and the third category is actually just a sub form of the first category, or how the third and the second category are really the same. So how in the categories of relation, for example, community is really just a sub form of causality and not its own category. Or they are writing how in the categories of quality, limitation is not really cannot really be deduced from the infinite judgments, and therefore limitation should not be there as a third category. And this is, they are hung up on some nitty-bitty details and completely missing the wider point. What they are saying, don't be fooled by their arguments, which might be very subtle and very academic, and might sound somewhat convincing if taken in isolation, but you have to consider the wider architectonic of Kant. You can't just go inside a house and just argue that, oh, this one pillar here or this one wall here, that's not nice. The architect should not have put it there. This pillar should be moved 3 meters to the left. You have to consider the static of the whole house. Maybe the whole house would break down if you move that pillar to the left like you want. So if someone wants to say, for example, that there should not be 4 groups of categories, there should just be 3, well, then he should explain how would our thinking arrive at these 3 groups. If the table of categories or of judgments is based on logical division, dividing our connecting into 2 classes, and then dividing these 2 classes again into 2, I have to have 4 groups of categories. So you would have to explain why I would divide one class into 2 and why I can't do that with the other class. Or if you want to tell me that in one of the 4 groups there should only be 2 categories, like maybe the third category is wrong according to you, it's not enough to give arguments why the third category is wrong. You would have to explain why there is this asymmetry here. Why in this case the intellect and the power of judgment might give us a concept, a category, but reason will not. This would be such a glaring hole in the architectonic. It would need to be explained. And these people don't explain it because they have no system in their thinking. They are not architectonic as Kant was. They are completely erratic and unsystematic. Their whole thinking is eclectic, while Kant's thinking, once again, was architectonic. And that is something that, again, is usually overlooked when Kant gets criticized, and therefore most of that criticism is completely worthless. It can be thrown away. It doesn't really need to even be refuted, because it really already refutes itself by not taking this architectonic into account. Like, of course, you don't necessarily have to conform to the architectonic. That would be an option. You could give arguments why the whole architectonic is wrong, why our thinking is not architectonic at all. But then you would have to go to the very fundament. Then you would not have to criticize one specific category. You would have to criticize Kant's thinking as a whole. But very often you can find in current academic papers that one specific category or type of judgment or two or so are criticized, while the whole picture is left untouched. And that just doesn't work. That just shows that you are superficial and that you have not really understood Kant and understood that these categories, they are not just random. They are within his framework actually necessary. But with that, let's move on. What I also want to clarify, I previously said that according to Kant, we have empirical concepts that we get through experience, and we have pure intellectual concepts, which he calls notions. And I want to clarify that these 12 categories, they are not the only notions there are. They are the basic notions, or the basic elements of all concepts, even the empirical ones, and therefore also of the pure ones, of the notions, but they are not the only notions. The other notions, however, are not basic fundamental concepts to Kant. They are concepts we get through combinations of various categories with one another. Kant gives different examples for that, like he says the concept of measurement is a notion that belongs to the categories of quantity, or specifically to unity, and the concept of a force or a power is a notion which belongs to causality, just like the concepts of activity and passivity. They also belong to causality, because, right, in a causal relationship you have one active part and one passive part. Or the concept of change, and then again the concepts of the different types of change, of becoming and of being destroyed. These concepts, he says, they belong to modality, because really they are a change. A change means that something exists and now it doesn't exist anymore, something else exists. Or it means becoming means that something is turned from possibility into existence. So these notions that are not fundamental but derived notions, these Kant calls praedicabilia, as opposed to the categories, which he also calls with the Latin name predicaments. These are praedicabilia. And Kant says you could give a complete list of all the praedicabilia, just like you can give a complete table of categories, because their number is limited, right? You cannot give a complete list of empirical concepts, because you could always form new empirical concepts. This empirical world, this world of experience, is endless for us, and we could always discover new things and form new concepts about them. But our thinking, so the basic structure, the skeleton, so to say, of our thinking, is limited, and therefore you could give a complete list of all the praedicabilia that you can derive from the categories. There are only 12 categories, and so their possible connections with one another, the possible concepts you can form by combining these 12 categories, their number is limited. And Kant does say that in a complete system of philosophy or of metaphysics, listing all the praedicabilia and to which categories they correspond, from which categories they are derived, and explaining all of them would be part of such a complete system of metaphysics. But in the critique of pure reason, which is not itself that system, but is just laying the groundworks for creating such a system, it is not possible, he says. And Kant himself never did that. We find attempts for it in his last writings, in his unfinished last work. He did start sort of listing the praedicabilia and giving explanations for what each of them mean, giving definitions, but it's something he never finished. Also, I will point out that not all non-empirical concepts are non-sensual. Empirical for Kant always means containing sensations, containing sense impressions, while it is possible to have concepts, so to use categories or the praedicabilia derived from the categories and apply them to the pure sensuality, that is to the pure forms of sensuality, to time and space. And that is exactly, Kant would say, what mathematics does, right? So mathematics, for example, may take concepts of quantity or derived from the three categories of quantity and then apply them to time or to space as such without using any empirical sense impressions. So a triangle is not an empirical concept, but it's not a pure intellectual concept either, because it does require space, which is sensual, which is the form of viewing. So it is an application of pure intellectual concepts to space as a form of viewing. But everything I explained so far in this lecture, how we get to the categories and how we can get from the categories to the praedicabilia, that's all very scholastic. I hope it's not too boring. Likewise, what I said in the two previous lectures where I explained the categories and the judgments, that's also very scholastic. And you may ask now, okay, fine, but what is the point of all of this? Why all this talk about categories, about pure intellectual concepts? And to Kant, this was immensely important. He said coming up with this table of categories and deducing it was the hardest part of the critique of pure reason, but also it is the most important thing that could be done for metaphysics. And only with this table of categories as a basis can metaphysics be ever a science. So why is that? Why was this so important to Kant? Well, remember once more what I explained in previous lectures, what thinking is to Kant. What the intellect does. Thinking is an act of synthesis, an act of combination and connection. Everything else is sensual. it is either a sensation, like wet or salty or warm, or it is time and space, that is forms of viewing in which we have these sensations. The only thing which is not coming from sensuality but from our intellectuality, the only thing which is not either a sensation or a form of viewing sensations, that is time and space, is this act of connecting and the connections it forms. And when our thinking reflects on this connecting it does, it gets the concept of a connection. And since we have 12 ways of connecting, when we reflect on these 12 ways, we get 12 concepts of connection. We get the 12 categories. So what this means is that all connections that we can ever think of, and again, all thinking is a connection. Every thought, every concept is a connection, is a synthetic unity of a manifold, is a rule, that a general representation, something that connects many attributes into one. A one that, again, connects many singular objects, many singular representations that we can have into one. So what Kant is saying is that all connections we can ever think, all thinking we can have at all, and all connections we can ever find in the world can be described in terms of these 12 basic connections, these 12 basic categories. That is why the table of categories is so immensely important. And you can try that for yourself. I said it previously. You will have a very hard time, by which I mean it will be impossible for you, to think of anything at all, without thinking some of these 12 categories, without really just using these categories and adding sensuality to them to specify them. So when you think a tree, for example, what are you really thinking there? You are thinking the category of substance and accidents. You are thinking the tree is a something, a substance, which contains certain attributes, certain accidents. Now, what specific something it is, what specific attributes it has, that is empirical. That the leaves are green, for example, and not purple, that is something you see. That the tree has this shape and not a completely different shape, that is something you see. But that it is a thing at all and has accidents at all, that is something you think according to this category of substance and accidents. And likewise, you will think of the tree according to the category of causality, because the tree grew from a seed. Now again, this specific application of causality, that is something you get from experience. Like, you don't know a priori that trees grow from seeds. In theory, the tree could have been born from an animal, or the tree could have just come from a chemical reaction, or I don't know what. The tree could have been could have fallen from the sky. But you think some sort of causality. You think of the tree as being the effect of a cause. The specific cause you get from experience, but thinking causality at all when you think of a tree, that is your thinking. Or I said, when you think of a murder, what does the concept murder mean? the concept of murder really means that you have a substance, the victim, which changes its accidents from being alive to being dead. And you have a sort of causality, because the murderer is the cause of that substance, of the victim, changing its accidents from alive to dead. So really, all our thinking, or rather all experience, Kant would say, is just that. It is just the table of categories, because that are the 12 ways in which we can form connections, letting us connect central data in certain ways. Or, to put it in another way, in all our thinking, in all our experience, sensuality gives the material, gives the content, but the form which all of this content has to have are these 12 categories. And there can't be any other form. Of course, nowadays, this claim of Kant's is very untimely. It basically goes against the very ideology of our age. Our age is an age of relativism, and an age that denies any sort of universality and universalism. We nowadays often hear the claim that there is no common humanity or common human nature, and that we can't, therefore, as Kant tried to do, find a basic structure of thinking that is true for all human beings throughout different ages, throughout different cultures. Rather, the claim is very often that our whole thinking and therefore our whole experiencing the world depends on how we grow up, which impressions we have growing up, how we are socialized, what our culture is. Very often it is nowadays explained by language. Like people will tell you, there are languages which don't have different words for green and blue, so therefore the people growing up with these languages, they will see the world differently from you. They won't see green and blue as different colors, but just as shades of one and the same color. Or of course there are languages which seem to be even more radically different. Like there are some language which don't have numbers like we do. They only count one too many. So they seem to not make a distinction between 3 and 3,000. It's just more than 2, so it's many. And so therefore I've heard the claim that the people speaking that language, they don't really have a concept of quantity like we do. I've also heard the claim that certain people don't have a concept of time, even, because I've heard that there are languages which are not temporal in the way our European languages are, which don't have different tenses, which don't differentiate in that way between different time forms. But here what you should do is you should not just look empirically. So you should not just ask, when I look around at the various languages in the world, what phenomena can I find? But rather, if you do just that, you will be blind, you will be unstructured, you will only see chaos. You won't know what you are seeing. Rather, you should always ask the question of transcendental philosophy. That is the question for the condition of the possibility of something. So in this case, what would be the condition of it even being possible that some people, some tribe, some culture doesn't have a concept of time. And then you will probably find that this is not possible. Like, those people would have died out. How, if they have no concept of time, how can they plan into the future? How can they hunt today, not just when they are feeling hunger right now, but how can they hunt today for the next days? How can they plan for winter and storage food for the winter? How can they now construct, let's say, arrows to go on a hunt with those arrows the next day? Clearly, all human beings must have some sort of understanding of time. I'm not saying it must always be the same understanding of time. And I'm also not saying all languages must deal with time in the same way. But to say that some human beings just don't experience time at all, that's just ludicrous. Like, clearly, that's not possible. And the same, I would say, can be said of Kant's 12 categories. Surely, human beings can be very, very different, and surely there are very different cultures. And yes, I'm not saying that language does not shape the way we think and the way we experience the world. It surely does. There is a place for this sort of relativism. Like in the spirit of Kant and its sympathetic method, we don't have to throw anything away completely. We can find the partial truth in something. And when it comes to relativism, the aufklärt person will be a relativist on the surface, while the unaufklärt person will take many things for granted and as set in stone. The aufklärt person will realize how many of these things really are just dependent on one age or one nation, and could very well and very easily be different in another place and time. But the aufklärt person will not just be superficial. He will not just stay at the surface. He will also go below that to the roots. And when it comes to that, we should realize that we are all human. And therefore we must share some common traits, or else it would not make sense to say that we are one and the same species. There must be a common core, like just like our bodies can be very different and can surely be also modified, like through working out or through surgery, but still there is some basic commonality between our bodies. We all have the same basic skeleton to begin with, and the modifications only happen on that skeleton. And I think this is also very important to realize for moral reasons. These relativists, even if they don't want to say this, even if they don't draw this consequence, still they are dangerous, because the consequence of saying that humans are fundamentally different, that some tribes out there, they don't experience the world like I do at all. They have another language, therefore they are completely different. The consequence of that could very easily be racism, could very easily be saying, well, if they are not like me at all, I'm not responsible for them. I don't have to treat them as equals. Only if we realize that beneath the surface differences, there is a common core, there is a shared skeleton. We have one universal humanity. Only then can we have universal human rights. But anyways, I mean, just think about it. You will probably realize that every human being ever, no matter the culture or the language or the time, had to think in terms of quantity or quality or relation or modality. And you will probably realize that indeed all humans do apply these 12 categories. Like, let's take causality. We have this causal thinking. It's just natural to us. When you, and this goes for every human being probably who has intellect at all, when you perceive something happening, you will not believe that it's happening randomly and without cause. You will automatically believe that there is a cause, even if you don't immediately can find what the cause is. You assume that there is a cause. You assume that a priori. That's exactly the point for Kant. That proves that this concept of a cause is not something empirical, but rather is something that is in our thinking, in the structure of our thinking. Now, how we think of causes and what causes we may assume, that may differ. Like, for example, when you experience someone is getting sick, you will probably believe that he's getting sick for a reason. I think there has probably not been any human culture that said, oh yeah, people just randomly, sickness just comes over them. There's no cause at all. It just happens out of nowhere. No, of course not. They all said there's a reason for the sickness. Now, if you say, whether you say the sickness comes from bacteria causing that sickness, or whether you say, oh, that person has been cursed or has been possessed by evil spirits or whatever, that may differ. But some sort of cause everyone assumes to be there. No one will just say this is happening without cause. So therefore, don't be fooled by today's academic sophistry. Again, if you look it up, you will find many papers that tell you that, I don't know, Kant was wrong in the table of judgments because the universal judgments that he describes under the title of quantity, they are really just a form of hypothetic judgment, or the infinite judgment really isn't different from the negative judgment after all, or whatever. Don't listen to their arguments too much. Have what Nietzsche calls an occasional will to stupidity. So to be stupid, to be deaf to smart arguments, and do what these academics usually don't do. Take a step back, and rather than getting lost in the details, look at the whole without prejudice and simply ask the question, is it possible, for example, for any human being ever to think of any sort of quantity that is not one or many or everything? Or is it possible to have any thought about anything, be it a dog or a tree or a ghost or God, without thinking that this thing is either possible or actually exists or is necessary, or one of the opposites, so impossible, non-existing, and contingent. And you will find that everything you think, like, you may disagree on which category to apply to which thing, right? So, of course, the religious person will say that God exists, and the atheist will say that, no, he doesn't exist. And maybe the atheist will still say that God doesn't exist, but he could at least exist, he's possible. Or maybe some atheists will say, no, he's even impossible. But still, everyone will have to agree that we have to think of God as either possible or existing or necessary or their opposites. There is no other way of thinking. There simply isn't. And therefore, what Kant is doing here really is his version of ontology. In the lecture on what is metaphysics to Kant, I talked about which fields metaphysics has in his architectonic, and I said that one of those fields that, of course, Kant didn't come up with, that existed since antiquity, is ontology. So what you could translate as the doctrine of being. Kant prefers to translate it as the doctrine of essence. So that metaphysical science, which doesn't think about specific supersensual objects and their nature, like God or the soul, but rather which tries to think about an object as such, a completely unspecified object, not specified beyond being something. And ontology just wants to ask, what is the nature of something? No matter what that something is, no matter if it's a stone or God, no matter if it's something that exists or that is simply possible, what does it mean to be a thing at all? What are the basic components, so to say, of everything when we abstract from what sort of specific thing it is? Well, to Kant, what ontology would have to be is giving the table of categories with the 12 categories, also giving a full list of all the praedicabilia that you can derive from these 12 basic categories, also bringing these praedicabilia into some sort of order based on the table of categories, based on which categories they come from, and lastly explaining all the categories and the praedicabilia, so defining them, explaining what each of them mean, what each of their attributes are, what we are thinking when thinking that specific notion. And of course, like all explaining, this would not require a synthetic judgment, because it would not really extend our knowledge. It would only explain and clarify the knowledge we already, at least unconsciously, have. So like all explaining judgments, this would be done through analytic judgments. And that would be what ontology should be to Kant. First, getting all the categories and the praedicabilia based on them, and putting them in the right order, and then through analytic judgments, analyzing and describing and explaining them. But the important difference, as opposed to what ontology was to previous philosophers since antiquity and into his own day, till the Leibniz-Wolfian school, the important difference, of course, is Kant's transcendental turn, about which I already talked in my lecture on what is transcendental philosophy to Kant. The difference is that Kant says the name of ontology should maybe be replaced with the more modest name of an analytic of the intellect. Because what previous philosophers thought ontology was talking about the basic components, the basic attributes of an actual thing, a thing in itself, a thing independent of us. While what Kant says is that in ontology, we are really talking about our own intellect, our own consciousness. We are analyzing not the nature of things, because how could we? How could we know what the inner nature of a something is when that something is outside of us? We can only know about that something insofar as it appears to us. So we cannot know it as a thing in itself. We can only know how we are affected by that thing. Rather, to Kant, this ontology, or now analytic of the intellect, cannot deal with what a thing is, but with how our thinking works, and therefore how we must think of a thing. And so this ontology cannot give us the basic attributes of all things, of things in themselves, but still it is an ontology insofar as all the things that we think and all the things that we experience insofar as all our representations are concerned. Because, of course, all our representations have to conform to our thinking. All the things that appear to me, no matter what the things in themselves are, all the things that appear to me must appear to me as conforming to those 12 categories, because otherwise they could not appear to me. I can only think in those categories, therefore all the things that I think of will indeed have these categories as their basic attributes. I just must not make the claim, which would be a transcendent claim, not transcendental, but transcendent, that even the things that are beyond my consciousness, even the things that are not my representations but existing in themselves, that even they are described by these categories. And that's why it's no longer an ontology, a doctrine of being, but rather an analytic of the intellect, of my own intellect, and just a doctrine of how I think being, and therefore just a doctrine not of all being, but of the being of the things that appear to me, that are in my consciousness. You could say what this table of category is to Kant and why it's so important to him. It is somewhat like the periodic table of the elements in chemistry. Like in chemistry, the periodic table of the elements is supposed to contain all the basic elements the universe is made up of. So we say we have oxygen and hydrogen and gold and iron and so on, and that's it. And we say that everything there is in the world is either made up of one of these elements, or it's a molecule that combines several of these elements, like water combines hydrogen and oxygen. And therefore, the whole world can be described through this periodic table of the elements. And, well, the same is true for the table of the categories. So this is not about material elements out of which the material things are made, but rather this is about the elements of our thinking out of which all thoughts are made. And of course, there's also one important difference in that the periodic table of the elements is something we found only empirically, and therefore we can never be quite sure that it's really complete. I mean, it's bigger now than it was when it was first established, right? Because with time, we have found new elements, so we had to extend this periodic table of the elements. While the table of categories is something found not a posteriori, but a priori, not from experience, but from thinking, and therefore Kant claims and has reason to make that claim that it is complete and can never be changed or extended. But now imagine that we had the periodic table of elements, and it would even be talked as a sort of historic data when you study chemistry. Like they would tell you, some past chemists came up with this periodic table of the elements, but then it would not get used in actual chemistry. Like when you are actually combining substances, when you're actually combining elements, you would not use this table to understand the reactions that are happening. Well, that would basically be the state of current day philosophy. Of course, Kant, therefore also the table of categories gets talked about. Of course, it might get a mention in a lecture. Of course, you might even read it and interpret what Kant might have meant with it. But you don't really there might be some exceptions, but usually you don't really find anyone who actually uses this table of categories for anything, who actually applies it. But that is what Kant intended and what he himself did. If Kant is right, if this is really the table containing all the basic elements of our thinking, then that would mean that every thought can be described by this table, and that every thought can be divided into 12 parts, or at least into 4 parts, according to this table. And this is something that Kant himself actually does throughout his writing. And that is also why this table of categories, which is as the basis of his architectonic, is so important, and why you need to understand it if you want to understand not just singular thoughts of Kant's, but if you want to understand Kant systematically. Because Kant will not always outright say that he's using the categories here in this or in that place, but still he does it. So you should be alert whenever you find the number 12, or also 4 for the 4 basic groups, or also 3 for the 3 categories in one of these groups in Kant's writing. Whenever he says, oh, there are 3 forms of this, or there are 4 forms of that, even if he doesn't outright say that he's basing this on the categories, you should reflect on how this might correspond to the categories, and you will probably find that it does map onto the basic structure of the table of categories. And I will give many examples in coming lectures when I talk about various parts of Kant's philosophy. So I will not go into all of these examples. But I do want to give some examples, and will therefore here now get into some things that I might not mention in later lectures and not further explain in later lectures. So, for one example, in the critique of practical reason, there is another table of categories, this time categories of freedom as relating to good and evil, as Kant says. And this table of the categories of freedom, so how do we have to think the idea of freedom, relates directly to the basic categories that Kant gives in the critique of pure reason. So Kant says that according to these basic categories, there are 12 ways in which we can think of free actions. So starting with quantity, he says that we can have subjective maximes. So I can base, that would correspond to unity, I can base an action on a subjective rule that I give myself, how I want to act. So that would be singular. Or the action can be based on an objective rule, on an objective prescription. That would correspond to the many, to multiplicity. Or, finally, the action can be based on the actual moral law, which means a sort of universality, which means that at the same time it is an objective law applying to everyone, but also, if I actually act according to it, if I'm actually a moral person, it is also a subjective maxim that I decide that I myself want to follow. When it comes to quality, I can think of practical rules of desiring, Kant says. That would correspond to the category of reality, or to the affirming judgments, right? So I want something, I do something. Or there could be rules of refraining, so not doing something, which obviously corresponds to the category of negation or to the negative judgments. And finally, there can be the concept of the exception. So something is usually forbidden, usually I should refrain, but in this case, it may be allowed. In this case, I may do it. So this obviously corresponds to limitation or to the infinite judgments. And when we come to thinking about freedom in terms of relation, then Kant says we can act, and our action can be directed at someone's personality. Personality would correspond with the substance. Or we could act and the action could be directed at someone's state. The state to the personality would be like the accident to the substance. So acting towards someone's state, changing his state with our action, that would be that would correspond to the category of causality. Right? That's what happens in causality. One substance changes not another substance as such, but another substance's accidents. So here we are changing another person's state. And lastly, corresponding to the concept of community or to the whole and the parts, we would have mutual action between two persons, each affecting the other's state. Well, and then if we look at the concepts of modality, that is the categories of the possible and impossible, of existence and non-existence, and of necessity and non-necessity or contingency, what we get in the table of the category of freedom is first that which is allowed, so it is morally possible to do it, and that which is forbidden, so it is morally impossible. So it might be physically possible, like of course it is physically possible to murder someone, but morally it is impossible because it is forbidden by the moral law. And then second, we have duty and that which is against our duty. That would correspond to the category of existence or non-existence. So duty is that which must exist, an action that must happen, and an action against duty would be something which in moral terms must not exist. And finally, corresponding to necessity, we have the perfect duty and the imperfect duty. This is something I will explain further when I get to Kant's moral philosophy, but basically Kant divides all our moral duties into perfect duties that we must necessarily do. Like, for example, don't murder, don't steal, don't rape, don't lie. And imperfect duties that we should also do, like help other people, help the weak, help the poor, help people in need. But they are only imperfect duties because the perfect duties come first. But this table of categories of freedom is really just one of many, many examples of Kant applying the basic table of categories or the basic structure of that table to all sorts of fields of thinking. For example, you can also find in his writings at some point, he thinks about the possibility that maybe the basic forms of calculating in mathematics could be based on the basic groups of categories. So Kant says that addition belongs to quantity, because when I'm adding something, I have one quantity, like let's say I'm adding 2 to 3, I have 2, and now I'm adding other quantities to it to get a bigger quantity. And subtraction, Kant says, corresponds with quality, because here I have a given quantity as real. Like, let's say I'm subtracting 2 from 4, then I have the quantity 4 as a given reality, and now I'm negating it in part. Then thirdly, the multiplication would correspond to the categories of relation, Kant says, because here I have a number coming into being in a causal relationship, being caused by the multiplication of other numbers. So these other numbers, this multiplication is the cause, and the number I arrive at, the product of that multiplication, that is really the effect. And lastly, division, Kant says, is corresponding to modality, or specifically to necessity, because when dividing a number, I'm asking, so to say, for that number which is its necessary cause. I'm asking for the numbers out of which this number I'm dividing necessarily grows, so to say. So, right, when I divide, let's say, 20 by 4, then I'm asking which number, if multiplied with 4, necessarily produces the number 20. And these, Kant says, are the basic ways you can think of numbers, right? You can, according to quantity, add one quantity to another. According to quality, you can take a given reality of a quantity and negate it somewhat. According to relation, you can ask some numbers multiplied, what other number do they cause? Or according to modality, you can ask what is the necessary cause that necessarily produces this number. But maybe let's turn to more simple examples that are even more clear. Kant, for example, talks about what is a good definition. How should we define something? What are the criteria that a good definition should meet? And when you define something, that is obviously an act of thinking, just like mathematics is an act of thinking. So that means if all thinking is based on the table of categories, the concept of a definition should be able to be explained through the table of categories, Kant says. And here he says that a good definition should have a certain quantity, namely, it should be detailed, but also precise. Namely, the definition you give must be neither wider nor more narrow than the concept you want to define. So let's say you want to define what a mammal is. Now, you must not say that mammals have fur or that they live on land, because that would be a too narrow definition that doesn't fit all mammals, because of course there are also mammals like whales that live in the water. But on the other hand, you can also not just say that mammals are living beings or that they have a skeleton, because that is too wide a definition. That doesn't fit just mammals, but also other sorts of animals. Now, if you ask what quality should a good definition have, Kant says it must be both comprehensive and precise. So it should contain everything that, well, belongs to that concept, but also not more than necessary. It must not be too wordy, but it should be on point. And when you ask about the relation of a good definition, Kant says, well, it should obviously be related to the object you want to define, and should actually explain that object, and should not be merely tautological. Like you can't define a thing with itself, right? I can't say a mammal is a mammal or a dog is a dog. That's not a good definition. And lastly, when it comes to the modality of a definition, it must be necessary. So we must define a thing not through contingent attributes. So I can't say that, for example, mammals birth living young, because that might be true for almost all mammals, but it is not true for all of them, and it is not absolutely necessary in order to be a mammal. But what I can say when defining a mammal is that the mammal gives milk to its young, because that is what it means to be a mammal, right? Or when talking about what a body is, I must not say that a body has a certain weight, because why that might be true for all the bodies that we can observe in the world, it is still not necessary. We could at least imagine a body, so something extended in space, that was completely weightless. Even if it's not physically possible, maybe it could be imagined, and if it was possible, it would still be a body. So we must think what is necessary in order to be a body, and that would of course be, well, extension, being not a mathematical point, but being extended in space. And that is what makes up a good definition, Kant says. Because we can also ask, what is a perfect concept? After all, a definition is always about a concept. We want to define a concept, explain what that concept is. And Kant says a perfect concept can also be explained according to the four groups of categories, of course. Kant says a concept is perfect if its quantity is general. I mean, that is what a concept is, and I talked about that in the previous lecture on the intellect and its concepts. A concept is a general rule. It is not a singular representation, but a general representation applying to many things. So the quantity of the concept must be general. The quality, Kant says, must be clear. Clarity is what makes a perfect concept, if we ask about its quality. When it comes to the relation, then a concept must be true. And if you ask what does that have to do with relation, well, a concept as such, as a thought, is in us. It is our representation. And now it must be related to its object, because that is what truth is to Kant. Truth is the identity between a representation and its object. So if I say dogs are fish, if that is my concept of what a dog is, then that concept, that representation I have in my mind, does not relate to the actual dogs out there in the world that I can observe. But if I say that dogs are mammals, then my concept of a dog is true, because it has a correct relation to the concept, to the actual dogs. Well, and then if you ask about a concept's modality, Kant says a concept must have certainty. So it must be a necessary concept. But once again, as is always true when it comes to modality, I talked about that in the lecture on the table of judgments and the lecture on the table of categories. The modality is, unlike the other three groups of categories, not so much about the thing we think, and rather about us, the thinker, and the mode in which we think. So while the quantity of generality and the quality of clarity and the relation of truth, while them being there or not being there, changes the actual concept that we think. Thinking that concept with certainty or without certainty doesn't change the concept as such, right? So I can have the concept of a turtle and say that turtles are reptiles, and now I can be certain of that, or I can be uncertain if they really are reptiles, if that concept is really true, or if maybe they are amphibians. That doesn't change the concept and its content of saying turtles are reptiles. It just changes how I think of that concept, whether I'm certain of myself or not. But these are the four parts that make up a perfect concept, Kant says. And by the way, Kant also makes a distinction between logical concepts, so concepts that are about truth, about cognition, concepts as the scientist would use them, and aesthetic concepts that maybe the poet would use. And therefore, Kant says that this basic definition of what a perfect concept is, it has generality, clarity, truth, and certainty. This definition is true both for logical and for aesthetic concepts. But what these four things, generality, clarity, truth, and certainty, what they actually mean, that is different whether you take the concept to be logical or aesthetic. So, for example, the quality every concept should have, the quality of clarity. Kant says when we are talking about a logical concept, then clarity means abstraction. It is most clear in the logical sense what I mean by a certain concept if I abstract from everything which does not belong to that concept. So I'm most clear, once again, when I'm precise in my definition. While on the other hand, if it's an aesthetic concept, it is most clear, Kant says, when it's most lively. So I should probably not abstract from everything that doesn't belong to it, but rather I should give many examples. And every example, because it is not the concept as such, but a specific individuation, so to say, of that concept, every example will contain parts that don't belong to the concept, right? So if I give an concrete example for a dog, then that specific dog will be brown or white or black, and these colors are not part of the concept of what a dog is. But still, giving examples, not giving an abstract definition of what is a dog, but rather pointing at specific dogs, makes the concept more lively, and therefore gives it bigger, and therefore gives it greater, not logical clarity. Like I maybe don't think more precisely what a dog is if I'm giving many examples, but it gives the concept greater aesthetic clarity. Or likewise, when it comes to truth, Kant says truth is always a sort of relation between the representation and the thing being represented. But logical truth means a correct relation to the actual thing. And aesthetic truth means a correct relation to the appearance of the thing. So when the poet says that at sunset the sun sinks into the ocean, then in the logical sense that is obviously untrue. The sun is far away from the earth and its oceans, and it does not sink into the ocean. But Kant would say that, of course, a scientific text shouldn't be written like that, because that should be about clear logical truth. But a poem might be written like that because it's aesthetically true, because the sun does not actually sink into the ocean, but it appears to be sinking into the ocean. That's what it looks like for us. And the aesthetic truth is about truly describing this appearance, this illusion, not what's actually going on. Or to give one more example, that Kant also gives in the Critique of Pure Reason, the concept of nothing. What does nothing mean? To Kant, this is at the basis of ontology, like the basic fundamental concept of ontology is basically a thing, and then the first division you can make with the concept of a thing is into something and nothing. So a thing that exists or a thing that isn't a thing, that doesn't exist. And now you could ask, what does this mean? What do I mean when I say nothing? And once again, nothing is a thought. Nothing is a concept. And since all our thinking happens according to the table of categories and its structure, I must therefore think the concept of nothing according to one of the four titles of categories. So that means, Kant says, there are really four different nothings. There are four ways in which this concept nothing can be meant and used. There can be a nothing in quantity. That means that I have what Kant calls an empty concept. So I think of something, of a concept, and again, a concept is always a general representation. It's always a rule or a set of rules. And so I can think of, for example, the unicorn. Then that concept contains a rule saying all unicorns look like horses with a horn on their head. And now when I say the unicorn is nothing in terms of quantity, I'm saying there are no unicorns in the world. So that means I'm saying there is no object in the world corresponding to that concept. I can think of that rule, a horse with a horn on its head, but this rule doesn't apply to anything in the world. There is no object that falls under that rule. That is exactly what, once again, Kant calls an empty concept, or also in the terminology of philosophy back then, it would be called ens rationis, which Kant translates into German as Gedankending, so an object of thought, a thinking thing. So it's a thing that we just think, that our thinking produces, but there is no corresponding intuition, no corresponding viewing. The thing can't be found in the world. That's why it's an empty concept. And this maybe explains better this famous quote of Kant's, which I mentioned in previous lectures, where he says that, sure, viewing without concepts is blind. Like if you just had sensual perception, but no concepts, no rules applied to that perception, you wouldn't know what you are perceiving. But on the other hand, he says, thoughts or concepts, those are really more or less synonyms for Kant, concepts without viewing are empty. I can make all sorts of concepts. That means I can make all sorts of rules. I can have the concept of a unicorn or a dragon, or of elves or orcs, or of magic, or of telepathy or whatever. But as long as there is no viewing corresponding to that concept, as long as I don't find an object in experience to which I can apply this rule, it is really an empty concept. I cannot say that it is real. I cannot even say Kant stresses that it is possible. I can only say it's an ens rationis. It's a thing of my thinking and nothing more. And this, by the way, that's an important point of the Critique of Pure Reason. This is true for all the objects of metaphysics, like God. God is such an ens rationis. God is nothing in terms of quantity. And that is something that even the religious person has to admit, because just like the unicorn, we can think of God, we can make a concept, a certain rule, like God is a being that is almighty and all-knowing and so on. But we have no viewing of this concept. We don't find one or many objects in the world that this rule could be applied on. And therefore, it is for us an empty concept. That is not saying that God doesn't actually exist. I will talk about that more when I get to Kant's philosophy of religion. But in terms of quantity, God is a nothing. In the empirical world, in the sensual world, we don't find, we can't have a viewing corresponding to this concept of God. Now, when it comes to quality, Kant says that nothing means a negation of a certain reality, right? So here we have a lack of viewing, more specifically a lack of a certain sensation, and we are forming a concept to describe this lack. So nothing in terms of quality would be something like darkness or like cold. So here we are not saying, like with the concept of the unicorn or of magic, that something corresponding to this concept of ours, to this sort of ours, can't be found in the world. But rather here we are saying that we find in the world a lack of something, a lack of heat or a lack of light, and we give a concept, we give a name to that lack. When it comes to relation, nothing to Kant means the empty form of viewing. So everything we view, we must view in time and space. Everything that appears to us, that affects us in time and space. And nothing in terms of relation would be a thing that has no relation to us, that doesn't affect us. Therefore, that doesn't appear to us. And that would mean that the forms of viewing that we have, time and space, that they stay empty. And lastly, nothing in terms of modality would be the impossible, would be the thing which can't be, because the very concept contradicts itself. Like the circle with angles or the four-angled triangle. Something, a rule that we can't even think because it is self-contradicting. So here you can note that this nothing, that this fourth nothing is sort of the opposite of the first nothing. The first nothing, the ens rationis, the thinking object, that is something that is possible to think. So I can think this rule, I can think of a unicorn, but I don't find it in the world. I don't have a viewing corresponding to that possible thought. While here, this nothing in the first case, this nothing in the fourth sense, the impossible thing, here I'm not just lacking viewing of that object, but rather I can't even think of that object properly, because the very thought is impossible. And then, of course, as Kant says, from this you could also deduce what something means, something being the opposite of nothing. So you could probably say that something in terms of quantity means a thing that you can have a viewing or an intuition of, a thing that you can find in experience, no matter what it is. Something in terms of quality would then mean a reality, right? Like heat or like light. So something which is there. Not a concept describing the lack of a reality, the negation of a reality, but rather the concept which has corresponding sensations that we can have. And something in terms of relation would mean a thing that does have some sort of relation to us, that does affect us somehow, and therefore does appear in time and space. So time and space filled with something. And something in terms of modality would then be the possible. So something that doesn't contradict itself, and that therefore, even if it doesn't exist in the end, could exist. Something that can be thought of and conceived of. Now, the reason I'm giving these examples is not because you necessarily need to know these things to understand Kant's philosophy as such. You don't necessarily need to know what a good definition is to him, or how he defines nothing, or what he says about the four basic forms of calculating. But I give these examples for the reason you give any example for anything at all. Again, Kant says that a good concept should have clarity, and you can achieve that clarity best in a logical and a scientific way, maybe by being precise. And that is certainly what he tries to do in the Critique of Pure Reason. But these lectures of mine, they are not meant to just be logically perfect. They are not meant to be simply scientific. They are meant to be open to a broader audience, and I want everyone to understand Kant, and that is why I want to give a certain aesthetic clarity to Kant, and that, as he says, is best achieved through examples. So what I want you to take away from these examples is that always, again and again, no matter what different things Kant might be talking about, always he is dividing and describing things according to the categories. And these categories, they really are the key to his architectonic. Once you have understood them, you will find them everywhere in Kant's writing. And you will then understand why he writes as he writes, or rather, why he says what he says. Because if you agree with the basic premise that these 12 categories really are the elements of all our thinking, then you must agree that through them we can always be thorough and complete. Then you must agree that if you think anything, any of our concepts through those categories, you have thought everything that can be thought about that. So, for example, in the previous lecture on the table of judgments, I said that Kant explains the basic principles of logic. So, first, the principle of contradiction or the law of identity. Second, the principle of sufficient reason. And third, what he calls the principle of division, or what can be called the principle of the exclusion of the middle between contradictory opposites. These three logical principles, Kant says, correspond to the three judgments of relation or of modality. As long as you don't realize this, you could say, well, maybe there are more basic logical principles, or maybe there are less. Maybe, I don't know, somehow the principle of sufficient reason can be derived from the principle of contradiction, which is something that had been tried before Kant. But now, if Kant is correct, you can say, yes, these must really be the basic logical principles of all our thinking, and these must be all of them. We don't have to seek any others, because we can be sure that these three are all there are. And if you think back on the previous lectures I gave on Kant, you can find that many things I mentioned there and I explained there now make more sense if you think about them coming from the table of categories. For example, I said, including in this very lecture, that to Kant there are three types of division. There's logical division, there's empirical division, and there is metaphysical or transcendental division. Well, you could ask, why these three types of division? How can Kant be sure when he says that these really are the three types of divisions you can make? How can he be sure that there isn't a fourth type that he just didn't talk about? Well, probably because if you think about it, they correspond to modality, right? The logical division corresponds to possibility. I mean, it is just dividing by applying the principle of contradiction. It is just dividing a thing in A and non-A, for example, saying that all human beings are either alive or dead. So that is a possible division you can make. Now, the empirical division corresponds to existence, because this is a division you actually make, and it only comes into being by actually being made. Like when you say all human beings can be divided into Germans and Frenchmen and Englishmen and Italians and so on, and you name all the countries, that's a division you can make, but you don't have to make. You could also say all human beings can be divided into young people and old people, or they can be divided into all sorts of divisions you can empirically come up with. And then the last form of division corresponds to necessity, because this is a division you arrive at necessarily when taking the logical division and combining the two parts. And it is necessary that each division you make in metaphysics, not empirically, not in simple logic, but in metaphysics, it is necessary that whenever you think a concept a priori through and all the possible ways in which this concept can appear, that you arrive at three parts. Or also, what I said in the lecture on what is science to Kant, I said that to Kant, when you have various things being in some sort of composition, there are two possibilities. They can either be subordinated or they can be coordinated. Here too, you could ask, why these two, and how is Kant certain that there isn't more? Well, composition is obviously a sort of relation, right? When you have a composition, you need to have at least two parts that are put in some sort of relation to one another. And now you can realize that relation, according to the table of categories, must either be a relation of causality, and that corresponds to subordination, so the effect is subordinated to the cause, or a relation must be a relation of various parts that are in one and the same whole, right? Corresponding to the disjunctive judgment of either or. And this sort of relation corresponds to the composition of coordination, where you have several parts sort of next to each other. And Kant says that apart from looking at things as being subordinated or coordinated, you can also look at them in a distributive way. That means looking at one thing individually and not in composition with other things. And this, of course, distribution, would then correspond to the category of substance, just looking at one singular substance and not its relation of subordination or coordination to other substances. And these three ways of looking at things, in distribution, in subordination, and coordination, this also gives you the three parts of pure metaphysics. Here I refer back to my lecture on what is metaphysics to Kant. In that lecture I said that to him metaphysics has various parts, and to him there is applied metaphysics, where you think metaphysically, that means a priori from pure reason, not a posteriori from experience, but you think metaphysically about things which you can also experience. And there's pure metaphysics, in which you don't just think metaphysically, so only using reason, not experience, but you also think about things which you don't need to have experience of. And if you ask how could this pure metaphysics be divided into subfields, then obviously you cannot divide it by using experience. So the division can only happen in our thinking. I am thinking of a thing independently of my experience. What are the ways I can think such a thing? Well, Kant says these three ways, according to the three categories of relation. I can think of a thing distributively, so just of an individual thing, abstracting from whether and how this thing might be related to other things. And if I just want to think of an individual thing as such without any experience, then I have ontology, which is exactly that, right? Ontology thinks about what even is a thing. Or Kant says, I can think of things as being subordinated to each other. And of course, I'm not doing natural science here, so I'm not using experience to look at specific subordinations to find that, for example, the sun is the cause for the ice melting. Rather, I just think of things as such and of subordination as such, and that will lead me to the thought of one highest thing, to which all other things are subordinated. So that will lead me to the thought of God. And so I have rational theology. And lastly, if I just think of things as such, but I think of them not as being subordinated, but as being coordinated, as being parts of a common whole, then that whole, which contains all the things as its parts, is called the world. So I get rational cosmology. And that is exactly why pure metaphysics needs to have these three fields, Kant says, and why there can't be more fields, because I can only think of an object as such, or as depending on another highest object, or as forming a whole with other objects. There is no fourth way of thinking of an object, as long as I don't want to use experience and whatever experience might tell me about objects. So that's why metaphysics, pure metaphysics, must have these three fields and no others. Just like you could say that applied metaphysics, where I do use experience, must have the two fields of rational physics and rational psychology, because if you don't ask how can I think an object, but rather how can I in general experience an object, Kant would say, well, I can experience it through the outer sense, and there I experience bodies in space, physical bodies, or I can experience it through the inner sense, and there I experience myself, my own representations, and therefore my soul, or how my soul appears to me, my psyche. And this means that we have these five fields in metaphysics. We have rational physics and rational psychology, we have rational theology, rational cosmology, and we have ontology. And this is exactly what Kant means by architectonic. Maybe now what I said in that lecture about architectonic becomes more clear. The architectonic to Kant means exactly that. I'm not making up fields of the science at random, but rather I take the idea of the science, and then from that idea I deduce all the necessary parts, and thereby I get all the fields that I must work on. I mean, that doesn't yet tell me if I can get answers in that field. Like rational theology, as Kant will show, cannot really prove that there is a God, but at least there must be a rational theology as an attempt, as a problem. That is something that is just rooted in how our reason functions. We just get, if we think about it, we just arrive at this idea of God, and so it is a quest for us, even if it's a quest that ultimately proves to be unsolvable, to think about that. And this architectonic, based on the table of categories, that also is what guarantees completeness to Kant. That is how he can be sure that the science is now complete with all these fields, and there can't be another field that we overlooked. I will stress that, of course, this can only be applied, this table of categories for the architectonic, when we make an a priori division. This can only be applied to pure thinking. Kant is not saying that it can be applied to things that are empirical. So, of course, if, for example, I want to ask what subfields must not metaphysics but biology has, then I can't just go by the table of categories to know that there must be such a subfield as ornithology, the study of birds. If I want to do biology, the study of life in general, that is something I can't deduce from the table of categories. Like birds don't have a specific place in the table of categories, but rather I need experience to tell me that birds are one of the class of living beings that there are, just like there are fish or insects or whatever. And if I didn't have that experience, which, I mean, could be possible, we could think of a world without birds. I mean, evolution theory tells us that birds are relatively young, that some so and so 1,000 years ago there were that some time ago in the history of the earth there were no birds. So if we had no experience of birds, then of course we could not think of such a field in biology. But when it comes to pure thinking, that is when we can apply this architectonic based on the table of categories, Kant would say. I want to give one last example from the topics I already discussed in previous lectures. And I want you to think of my lecture on dogmatism, skepticism, and criticism, what they mean to Kant. And there I said that to Kant there are only these three types of philosophy. And here you could ask, how can Kant be sure of that? I mean, for the longest time, there were only dogmatism and skepticism. It took over 2,000 years of doing philosophy before Kant, as the first person ever, came up with criticism. So how can we be assured that there isn't maybe a fourth possible way of doing philosophy that just no one has thought about, and maybe it will take another 2000 years before someone does? And the thing is that most people, when reading Kant, will not ask this question. When Kant says that there's only dogmatism, skepticism, and criticism, they will be concerned with what does he mean by that. They will try to understand how he uses these words, but they will not really ask how is he sure that these are the only three kinds of philosophy. That includes the experts, the academics. That includes myself. For the longest time when reading Kant, I didn't ask this question. It didn't occur to me. We are not really used to thinking so systematically and in such an architectonic manner as Kant does. And so when someone lists things to us, when someone gives us a list and says there's only A, B, and C, as long as we don't come up with another thing, D, as long as it isn't immediately obvious to us that that guy forgot something that we can think about, then we may just accept this list he gives us and be like, okay, sure, somehow sounds right or feels right, so why not? Without questioning it. And to be sure, I'm not certain that Kant himself asked this question in this case. He certainly never says that these three types of philosophy correspond to the table of categories. Maybe he thought it and just didn't write it down. But it is possible that in this case he didn't think it. But that's really besides the point, because if Kant is correct and these are the 12 basic categories of our thinking, then we must think in these terms whether we are conscious of it or not. Again, you can compare it with the periodic system of the elements. Water doesn't have to know that it is made up of oxygen and hydrogen, but still, as a material thing existing in this world, it must be made up of some of these basic elements in the periodic table. But well, if you compare these three types of philosophy with the table of categories, I think it becomes obvious that they correspond perfectly to the categories of quality. Dogmatism corresponds to reality because it poses the reality of our metaphysical knowledge, making the affirmative statement that we can know things about God or about the soul and the life after death and so on. Skepticism corresponds to negation, saying, no, we can't have knowledge about these things. And criticism corresponds to limitation, because after a thorough criticism of our reason, of the source of our cognition, it comes to the conclusion that we can know certain things and we can't know other things. So it poses the reality of some knowledge that is, however, limited by the negation of other knowledge. And that way, we can also be assured now that there can't be a fourth way of philosophizing. When it comes to the quality of a philosophy, we can maybe still discuss which of these three is correct. But we cannot hope to ever find a fourth type of philosophy that has another quality than being dogmatic or skeptic or critical. Now, all of this architectonic thinking, according to the table of categories, once again, is very untimely. It is very much against the zeitgeist of our time. If today you try to pull this off at the academy, no one would take you seriously. You will get laughed at for taking Kant's table of categories seriously. I mean, this has started a long time ago already. Like, for example, Schopenhauer already makes fun of Kant and says that Kant is obsessed with symmetry and that he's forcing everything into his table of categories. But then, I mean, Schopenhauer was superficial and can't be taken seriously as a philosopher. So just because he says something doesn't mean it's the case. It probably just means that he didn't understand the table of categories properly, and therefore he couldn't find the sense in it. And once again, I want to stress, yes, I'm aware that our time has this almost instinctive, like it's not based on an actual argument, it's not based on actually considering the other possibility and then finding reasons why it's not true, but rather it's based on ideology, and therefore it's almost like an instinct. Our time has this instinctive aversion to all sorts of order and symmetry and systematic thinking. Our current thinking loves the chaotic, the eclectic, the unordered, the unstructured. But the thing is, and this is especially true in the so-called humanities or in the sciences of spirit, where you want to be as empirical and as relativistic as possible nowadays. But the thing is, if you compare to natural science, no one makes fun of a natural scientist for saying that there are constants in nature. So why shouldn't there be constants in thinking? Why shouldn't all human thinking have a basic structure? Now, I would accept maybe if you said it's not a structure that Kant claimed, he was wrong. If you gave me reasons for that, and if you came up with another table of categories that you found was better, I would be willing to discuss that. But just saying that no, there's no basic structure shared throughout all intellects, throughout all human thinking at all, that we could potentially discover. There are no general rules, general laws of thinking, like there are general laws of nature. Then, sorry, I can't really take this seriously. I mean, our time can, of course, stress that culture and that language shapes our thinking and experiencing the world to a very, very large degree, larger than previous ages were aware of. And that is true, and that is an important discovery. But you cannot just say that the human being is a complete nothing that can just be shaped, like our thinking, our intellect can just be shaped into anything. For something to be able to be shaped into various forms, it must be a something. It must have a certain quality. Like, you can, of course, take clay and say that out of clay you can make a plate or a vase or a cup or a statue. Yes, but still it is always clay, and no matter what form you give it, as clay, it will have certain common characteristics, and in it being clay, all shapes that could possibly be given to it are already sort of contained, while other shapes that clay just can't take by virtue of being clay are already excluded from the clay before you have shaped it. And then the same should be true for our thinking. And again, I have met many people who have this instinctive aversion to this table of categories. Like, for example, I've been told that someone wasn't content with Kant using the same categories both in theoretical and practical philosophy, applying it both to nature and to our own thinking, to our morality or to our rights and justice system. Someone told me that nature and human matters can't follow the same rules. But what we must understand is that this is about our thinking about nature and our thinking about human matters or about morality. And so, of course, it must follow the same rules because it is one and the same thinking. I mean, once again, you can claim that it's not the rules that Kant sets, that he was wrong somehow, and you can pose your own rules. That could be discussed. But to just say that the theoretical and the practical follow completely different rules, that would basically mean that once we stop thinking theoretically and once we start thinking practically, we sort of lose our intellect, our reason, and get a completely new one that works completely differently. I mean, ultimately, there is no such thing as theoretical and practical reason. There's only reason working in different fields, but it is still one and the same reason. So, of course, we should assume that this one reason always follows the same rules, the rules, so to say, of its own nature. I think that science and scholarship could profit a lot from taking this table of categories seriously, just like the chemical science profits a lot from taking the periodic table of elements seriously, and trying to use it for their architectonic. And I want to give 3 examples for this. Examples that don't just come from Kant, that come from myself. From me using his table of categories, like he himself might have had, maybe if he had applied it to other areas, to think it further. And I will add that this is something you must be able to do when dealing with a philosophy. Like, even if you ultimately disagree with that philosopher, the criterion for having understood something is being able to apply it. If you can only repeat and parrot what someone actually said, but cannot apply it to other instances that he don't talked about, then you haven't understood it. Like, you have not understood the theorem of Pythagoras if you can say how long the sides of a triangle are that your teacher used to teach you that theorem. You have understood that theorem if you can use it to calculate a triangle that your teacher did not give you the solution for. And the same is true in philosophy. You must be able to apply a philosopher, to think in his own way. And only if you can do that, again, you must be able to do that even if you think he is wrong. And only if you can do that, do you have a right to say whether he is right or wrong. Because if you haven't understood his manner of thinking enough to yourself get into it, and to yourself start thinking in that way, then it would be simply arrogant to dismiss that manner of thinking, which you evidently haven't even understood. So let's try to apply this thinking of Kant. Let's first look at philosophy, because that's what I already did some minutes ago, right? I said that according to quality, all philosophy must be, as Kant says, either dogmatic or skeptical or critical. Well, that should almost necessarily lead to the thought that maybe we can also apply the other 9 categories to philosophy, and thereby arrive at a table of all possible philosophical systems. Well, let's try just that. According to quantity, I could ask how many subjects of cognition are there. And I could posit that there's only one subject of cognition. That would be what is nowadays called solipsism. So the belief that you are really the only conscious being in the universe, and all the other human beings, they are just, I don't know, robots or part of your dream or whatever, but really there's only you. Or I could posit the multiplicity of the understanding of the conscious subjects. That would be the position that most people, pretty much every common person and also most philosophers take. Or I could take the position of the universality of the understanding subject. That would mean that, yes, there is a sort of multiplicity, but in the end, all these multiple subjects are really one, and their understanding, despite their surface differences, their understanding is really one understanding. That would be, for example, the pantheistic position of Spinoza, to whom there really is just God, and we are all just parts or accidents of God, and so therefore there really is only God's understanding. But it would also, in another way, with a transcendental turn, be the position of Fichte, to whom there is one absolute I, and then there's an individuation in several billions of eyes of individual consciousnesses, but really they are just individuations, they are just appearances of one general, of one absolute consciousness as such. Now, the quality of the philosophical systems I don't need to address further. They either say we can have knowledge, or the subject or subjects, no matter how many or how few there are, they can't have knowledge, or we can have certain limited knowledge. When it comes to the relation between the subject and the object about which it is trying to have knowledge, then we could claim that either there's only the subject and all the things are just representations of that subject. That would be empirical idealism. So the position that really the whole world is just in my consciousness, is just in my head. Everything is just my imagination, or I'm just dreaming everything. Which is the sort of idealism that Kant is fighting against. Or second, corresponding to the category of causality, you could say there's materialism, which says that all consciousness depends on being. So there is being, there's an object outside of me, outside of the subject. That is the cause, and I, or my consciousness, my thinking, is the effect of that being. I think differently, or I have different representations depending on how I'm affected by the things outside of me. Or lastly, you could have transcendental idealism, Kant's position, where there is a sort of community or mutual common system of subject and object, and they are depending on each other, and the thinking subject and the representation or the object being represented form a community. Well, and when it comes to the modality of philosophical systems, you could say that there's a philosophy of possibility, and that would be the classical dogmatic rationalism, like of the Leibniz-Wolffian school, which is what Fichte called a mere formula philosophy, just empty form, because they just use the principle of contradiction to just think of things as formally possible, but this philosophy doesn't really have content. Now, that is not how these rationalists would have characterized themselves. They thought that they had a content. They thought that they were proving existence of, for example, God, and not just possibility to think him. But really, if you think about what rationalism was, then it was just a philosophy of possibility. Second, you could have a philosophy of existence, which would be empiricism, right? Because that's what the empirical, what experience tells you, that something is not just possible, but it is actually there. And lastly, you would have a philosophy of necessity, which would be transcendental philosophy, because it is talking about the condition of the possibility of things. It is not just saying that something is possible to think about, or that something is actually there and we find it in experience, but rather it shows us how this experience is necessary, how this thing must be there for us, based on the rules of thinking or of experiencing as such. And if this was correct, and maybe it would need some further thinking about some further connections. This is just sort of a draft, just me and also a friend of mine who gave me some pointers and corrections, for which I'm grateful when it came to modality. Thinking about this a little, but if this is the correct table of the philosophical systems, then it would mean, since this philosophy is not empirical, it is thinking a priori, and since all our thinking happens according to these 12 categories, that would mean these are the only 12 ways of doing philosophy. Or not philosophy of all at all, because there's of course other fields of philosophy, like moral philosophy, which would have their own table of categories. But if we are just talking about the theoretical philosophy that deals with our knowledge, then this should be the complete table of all philosophical systems, and it should not be possible to come up with any sort of philosophy or worldview that does not fall into one of these 12 categories. All philosophies ever thought, and all philosophies that ever could be thought, would then just be variations of these 12 basic forms. That would be one example from philosophy. But let's go outside of philosophy. Let's take another science. Let's look at politology. So political science can talk about the systems of state, the systems of government. And here we have, since classical antiquity, we have the belief that there are really 3 systems of rulership. There is monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And how do we know this? Of course, the ancient Greeks, when describing these 3 systems, they arrived at them empirically. They just looked around in their city-states and they found that some were ruled by kings, some were ruled by some sort of noble aristocracy, and some were ruled by the people. But if you just do this empirically, you cannot be sure that it isn't possible that there could be a 4th way of rulership, maybe a way that no one has tried so far, or that no one has even thought up so far, and therefore it can't be experienced empirically, but still something that could theoretically exist. But now, if you use the table of categories, and of course, in this case, the categories of quantity, and you think about what quantities there are, then you realize that no, there can't be a fourth form of rulership, because you either have one person ruling, monarchy, or you have many people ruling, aristocracy, or you have all the people ruling, democracy. And those are all the quantities there are, so there can't really be any other form of rulership. And again, this maybe gives you a better sense of what the architectonic as a scientific method means to Kant, and what value he sees in it. The political science we have right now is largely empirical. Like, they are looking around at how politics are done or have been done in the past, and they are describing that. And therefore, if you go back to my lecture on what is science to Kant, they are not really scientific. This to Kant would be a form of historical scholarship. It should be called political studies, but not political science. If we ever want to have a true political science, then Kant would probably say, this is not an area that he talks about, but he would probably say that this science would need an architectonic based on the table of categories, telling the political scientist a priori what experiences he even could make, possibly, even before having made them, maybe. So telling the political scientist a priori what political systems they even could be. And when it comes to the quantity of the systems, again, they have been described even in antiquity, even though not by consciously using the table of categories. But maybe we can now use the table of categories to also fill in the other 9 categories and ask how else could we describe the state or the political body or the power and the law. And here I would posit that according to quality, we could say that there's either totalitarianism, that is absolute and unlimited reality of power, total power, or there's anarchy, so no power, no rulership at all, or there is some sort of limited power. For example, limited by a constitution, but not necessarily. Could also be limited in other ways, like just by some sort of balance, like the king having to balance his nobleman and not being able to just rule as he wants, but some sort of limited power. And if you ask about the relation towards the people that are being ruled over or governed, then you could say that at first, corresponding to the category of substance and accidents, we have fascism. Second, corresponding to causality, we have authoritarianism, or what we usually would call dictatorship. And third, corresponding to community or the whole and the parts, we have republicanism. Not to be confused with democracy. I will get more into that when I talk about Kant's political philosophy. So here by republicanism, I don't mean that the people simply vote, that the people simply have the power, but rather I mean that the citizens in the state form a true community where one depends on the other, and they are all part of a whole. And this would be a case, these categories of relation, where you can see maybe the value of using the table of category. Because if we just look empirically, then we might see authoritarianism and we might see fascism, And in both cases, we might see a lack of freedom, or we might see some guy at the top, some leader giving orders and oppressing other people. And we might make the mistake of subsuming both of them under the label of dictatorship. But I would claim that these two, so regular authoritarian, one-of-the-mill dictatorships, and on the other hand, actual fascist dictatorships, are very, very different. Because it becomes clear if you look at the corresponding categories. Authoritarianism corresponds to causality, so to one substance having an effect on another substance and changing not the other substance as such, but its accidents. In an authoritarian dictatorship, sure, the dictator gives orders and commands that you have to follow, and if you don't, you get into trouble. But apart from that, you still have a sort of independence from the dictator. In such authoritarian systems, there is such a thing as a private life. And it is often somewhat possible if you just stay quiet, if you just don't protest, if you just don't do anything against the dictator's will, to have a quiet and somewhat peaceful or somewhat successful life, and to be somewhat left alone. Not so in a fascist state. Here, the relationship, I think, should be sort of not according to causality, but according to substance and accidents, because the ideal of the fascists, so to say, is what the Nazis called Volksgemeinschaft, so the people's community, which they also described as Volkskörper, the people's body. So they really thought of the German people as one biological entity, as forming one body, and all the individuals basically just being cells in that one body. What fascism wants is for there to not be any individuals that the dictator would have to rule over and give orders to, but rather fascism wants the people to not be substances of their own, but mere accidents of the state or of the Volkskörper. And likewise, the dictator is not like the leader, the Führer. He is not supposed to be an individual, like its own substance that is having an effect on other substances. He is not supposed to impose his arbitrary individual will on the people and oppress them. Rather, he is thought of by the fascists to be sort of the embodiment of the shared common will of the people as a whole. And that is why we shouldn't think of the fascist state in terms of someone giving orders and someone having to follow them. We should rather think of it as all the people melting into one common being and just being parts or extensions or accidents, attributes of that being. And I think if we understand the political systems according to these terms, according to the table of categories, it helps us much better understanding fascism and also understanding what the difference between fascism and your classical authoritarian dictatorship is. Well, anyways, if we go over to modality, then we could say possibility corresponds to what has been called in political philosophy the natural state. So a state where there are no laws, no rights, but there could be. A state could be founded. Existence corresponds to a state which, well, exists and has certain existing laws, but the laws are arbitrary. The laws are not necessarily just laws. And necessity would correspond to the rational state. So a state that doesn't just give any random laws, but rather the laws that are necessary and just according to reason. Now that would be my attempt as at a table of political categories, so to speak. Let's look at one last thing. Let's look at religion, because here too we don't really have a religious science. We only have religious studies that empirically look at, well, what sort of expressions of lived religion we might find in the world. But let's think about the idea of God and how we can think God. And here, if we go with quantity, we find that, yes, of course, we can think of there being one God, that would be monotheism, or many gods, that would be polytheism, or we can think that everything is God, or that the all is God, and that would be pantheism. Like Spinoza said, Deus sive natura, so saying that God or nature or God and the world are really one. And once again, these are all the ways, if we just look at quantity, that we could possibly think about God. And there aren't really any other ways. And this is something that isn't dependent on whether you believe in God. Like, the atheist still needs to think of God in some way, or else he could not deny God, right? You must know what you are denying. You can't just deny a word that has no meaning for you. So everyone, whether religious or whether atheist, should be able to agree that these are the only three ways in which we can posit a God. We can either say there's one God, or there are many gods, or there's only God and everything is God. I don't see how there could be possibly a fourth way. And I don't want to give a complete table of the possible concepts of God. I just want to briefly talk about God in terms of relation, because that is something that Kant himself does. Kant says, I could think of God and the relation between God and creation either in terms of substance and accidents. And again, then I would have Spinozism. Then I would have some form of pantheism, where I would say that the only substance there is God, and everything else is not its own substance, but just an accident of God. Or I could think of God as having created the world, but the world existing outside, and in that sense, somewhat independently of God. That would be classical theism. And that would correspond to the category of causality. And if you consider the category of community, that would mean God and the world forming a community, acting on each other mutually. You could maybe, in the most general sense possible, describe this as a sort of hylomorphism. So hyle in Greek means matter, morphe means form. So hylomorphism is, well, it's a system in which matter is original and uncreated, and then form is given to matter. So God is not the creator of matter, but rather God is either himself the form, or he's the form giver, but he's only in either case bringing form into matter. And there could be various such systems. So Kant says that what corresponds to the third category would be the position of the Stoics, who believed God to be the soul of the world. So not pantheism in the sense of saying God is the world and there's nothing else but God, but rather saying, well, there is a world outside of God, but that world is just the shell or the body, and God is the inside, is the soul of that world. But I would also say that maybe certain Kabbalistic conceptions of God could be subsumed under the third category, because there is this belief that, well, the relationship between God and human beings, or at least the Israelites, is not just one-sided, God creating us and God giving us laws, but it is sort of two-sided. God sort of needs us, or needs the Israelites, to follow the laws, the Mosaic laws, and by doing so, they sort of repair the world that is fundamentally broken. And what they are doing through following the law is called tikkun olam, so repairing the world. And thereby you could say they are sort of helping God in a way. But anyways, you could also think the idea of God not just according to quantity or relation, but according to quality or modality. But I will not do so here. For one, the lecture is already long enough, but also I want to sort of give this to you as an exercise if you want. Because as I said, if we understood a philosopher, we must be able to think further in his own terms and methods. If we understood a philosopher, we must be able to apply him to things that he himself didn't apply his thinking to. So Kant only talks about God in terms of relation. He doesn't talk about the modality or the quality of God. But if you understood the table of categories, you should be able to do that. I think it's actually quite easy in this case. So you can try for yourself if you want, if you can complete this table of the possible concepts of God. But once again, what these examples are meant to show you is that if you agree with Kant's basic premise, then really you must agree that the table of categories allows for us to a priori come up with all possible ways to think of something. And now, of course, we still have to decide which of these ways is correct. Like, is monotheism or polytheism or pantheism correct? Is monarchy or aristocracy or democracy better? Like, of course, not everything is solved with that. Just like, I mean, Kant speaks of architectonic of a science. The architectonic is the basic structure of the science, but it's not itself the science, right? When the architect makes a plan for a house, there are still workers needed to actually erect a house according to one of the architect's plans. But still, there is certainly value in this. If we a priori can come up with all the possible ways of thinking something, and thereby can bring structure and clarity into our thinking, thereby can also know what our possible options are and where their limit is, where we don't have to try coming up with even more options, because we will probably just end up confusing things by doubling certain options and by presenting mere variations of options that are already there as new options. So once again, everyone who doesn't agree with this, I would challenge to simply try and think anything that is outside the table of categories. Think anything that is not solved with the table of categories. I think the categories of quantity, they are probably the most simple to understand and the most obvious and self-evident. So you can try and start with them. If you think that Kant is wrong here, that these categories do not depict the basic structure of all our thinking, I challenge you, think of a political system of rulership where we don't have rulership of one person, or of several persons, or of all the persons of the state. Or think of a possible conception of God where there isn't one God, or several gods, or everything is God. And you will probably find that this is impossible to do. And as long as someone can't give me any example of something that cannot be described in these 12 categories, I will have to assume that Kant was right in describing these categories. And as an Aufklärer, I want to also stress that it is not just science in the closer sense, or it is not just scholars which could profit from applying the table of categories, but rather our thinking as a whole, also the common thinking, can get more clarity and a better structure, and can become more correct if we just understand the table of categories, and if we learn to always, whenever a certain concept is used, ask according to which category it is used. Because many errors in thinking happen simply because we use a certain concept or idea according to the wrong category to which it doesn't belong. Let me just give you one example. A friend of mine showed me a lecture by some physicist who claimed to be able to, among other things, prove freedom through the existence of the multiverse. Now, how he can prove that there is a multiverse, I don't know. I always found, I will be honest with you, I always found this concept to be quite stupid. Like, it should probably be left in movies based on comics and not be taken much more seriously. It should not have a place probably in physics or philosophy. But okay, fair enough. Let's assume that somehow we can be absolutely certain that there is, as this guy claims, a multiverse. Now, what he said is that whenever I have an option, so let's say right now I could keep sitting here, or I could get up and walk out, there's a split, and then afterwards there are two universes, one in which I did A and one in which I did B. So right now there's a universe in which I'm still sitting here, that is this universe, and there's another universe in which I got up and walked out. And therefore, this physicist said, we are free, because therefore we can do both, because we actually do both in two different universes. He says this in such an arrogant and cocksure manner, it's mind-boggling. And what's even more mind-boggling, like, this is not just some weirdo guy. This is a physicist, a well-known physicist who writes best-selling books, a guy speaking at a university, being taken seriously by people. Like, this tells you a lot about the state of current academics if someone like this can become a professor. And this tells you a lot about the state of the wider discourse if someone like this is getting taken seriously. Because even if you assume that he's correct with this multiverse nonsense, then I'm sorry, but this is not proving freedom. Actually, quite the opposite. This would be proving that there is no freedom. Because according to which category has he sought freedom in his claim? Obviously, according to the category of community, of the whole and the parts. He's thinking of the multiverse as a whole, with several parts, with several universes, and each of these parts is determining the other parts while being determined by them. Why am I doing A right now? Not because I'm free to do A and also to do B. No, I must do A in this universe because the other me in some other universe is doing B. And why is he doing B? Because I am doing A, and therefore he can't be doing A, he must be doing B. So we depend on each other and determine each other. And if you look at the individual universe, it might seem that we are free, but if you look at the whole multiverse, you realize that there is no freedom because every possible action has to be taken somewhere in some universe. So all the actions happen all at once, so to say. And instead of proving freedom, this would disprove freedom. This is also one thing I immensely dislike about the multiverse and why I have this instinctive aversion against usually all sorts of stories, all sorts of movies that are based on this primitive notion of a multiverse, because it's so nihilistic. Like, if that was true, nothing would matter. Like, I might be a good person in this universe, but in another universe, I'm evil. Here, I haven't killed someone. In another universe, I'm a murderer. Like, nothing would matter. It's just pure coincidence that here in this universe, I'm not a murderer, but elsewhere I am. So, what's the point of not being a murderer? But anyways, clearly, this is an error in categories, because freedom should not be thought of according to the category of community, but, as Kant also says, according to the category of causality. Causality means A causes B. A is the cause, B is the effect. And what freedom means is being a cause without being an effect. Being able to start a new line of causality. Being free would mean that you yourself can affect other things and they depend on you, but you yourself don't depend on something else. And that is something that you can't prove, even if you could prove that there's a multiverse. But before concluding this long lecture, I want once more to turn back to Kant and the main question of his critique of pure reason. Because you have to realize that what Kant tried to do was not coming up with a complete ontology. What he tried to do was not coming up with a key to the architectonic of all the sciences and of all our thinking. He basically found this table of categories sort of by accident, and all the other benefits it might have are not what he actually tried to achieve. The actual question of the critique of pure reason, and I talked about this in a previous lecture already, his actual critical project is about the question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Now, a synthetic judgment is a judgment that combines several concepts, that synthesizes them. Like the synthetic judgment a posteriori, that ravens are black, combining the concept of a raven and the concept of blackness. And if you want to do a synthetic judgment a priori, then it should be clear that the concepts you're combining cannot be empirical concepts, like raven or black. If you get the concept only a posteriori, how could you synthesize it with another concept a priori? That makes no sense. So the synthetic judgments a priori require pure intellectual concepts, require concepts that we have a priori. And those are our notions. Those are the 12 categories, and then also the praedicabilia that could be derived from those categories. But of course, simply by combining them at will, arbitrarily, we cannot have new insights. Because we wouldn't know if these combinations are correct, if they work, if they lead to thoughts that correspond to real things, or if they just give us empty concepts. And here I must again stress what I already explained in a previous lecture where I talked about how logical synthetic judgments a priori are possible. All synthetic judgments need a third element in which the synthesis happens. And this third element is always viewing, is always intuition, Kant says. And since we don't have intellectual viewing, just sensual viewing, this third element is always sensuality of thoughts. Now, when it comes to synthetic judgments a posteriori, it is empirical viewing. Like, for example, I actually make an experience, I see black raven, and so I can make this judgment that ravens are black. When it comes to synthetic judgments a priori, it is time and space as the pure forms of our sensual viewing. But still, I must combine my categories or praedicabilia, my notions, in time and space, and therefore in sensuality. Kant has this famous statement that viewing without concepts is blind, but thoughts without content are empty. Kant's whole point is that we always need a sort of viewing. That's how he describes mathematics, right? It is not just combining concepts, it is combining concepts in time and space. I can think of a figure made up of two straight lines. And just this thought alone doesn't tell me that such a figure is not possible, that this could not enclose an area. Rather, I need to try and construct that figure in space, and then I will realize that to enclose an area, I need at least 3 straight lines and not just 2. But sensuality without thinking, without the intellect, is still something, according to Kant. Even if it's blind, even if we wouldn't know what we are perceiving, at least we would perceive something, like the animals do. It would just be a sort of chaos of sensations in time or in space. We couldn't make sense of it, but there would be something there. But on the other hand, thinking without sensuality is nothing to Kant. We would just have forms without content. We would just have empty concepts that don't contain anything, rules that can't be applied to anything. Kant says that, of course, I can come up with all sorts of things. I can come up with new powers of nature, according to which it is possible to turn lead into gold, or to communicate with other people telepathically. I can think of that, but as long as I have no viewing, no corresponding experience, I can't say that something like that exists. I cannot even say, Kant stresses, that something like this is possible. This is quite important to him. Most people would say that it is at least possible, but Kant says no. We must not confuse the possibility of thinking something with the possibility of it existing. When I say that something, like, for example, telepathy or God, can be thought possibly, I'm saying that, yes, I can have a concept of it, and the concept does not contradict itself. But that does not mean necessarily that a thing corresponding to that concept could exist in the world without contradiction. Because maybe there would be something in that inner nature of that thing, which I don't realize, which would make it impossible for that thing to exist. Maybe I can't see why, for example, telepathy would not be possible, but maybe within the plan of the creator, within the rule of a universe that could possibly exist at all, it is not possible for something like telepathy to exist. I can't say that. So this is what Kant stresses. Without a sort of viewing, we cannot just not claim that a thing exists or is necessary. We cannot even say that a thing, even if thinking it is possible, that a thing has any real possibility. What this means for Kant is that synthetic judgments a priori based on the categories are possible, but they must remain immanent judgments. They cannot be transcendent judgments, meaning they cannot be judgments about things in themselves, things which we can't possibly ever view, things outside of time and space, but rather they can only be judgments about phenomena, about appearances, about nature, about that which appears to us in time and space. So about these things, I can make a priori judgments. So I can say certain things about the world even before having experienced them. I can say a priori that everything I will ever experience, I will experience in time and space. Because these are just the forms of my viewing. If something was not in time and space, it would not be a thing to me. Or I can say a priori that I will never experience something without a cause. Whenever something will happen in the world, a thing falling down, a person being born or dying, any sort of movement, I will always be able to ask for the cause and to search for the cause. That I can say a priori. But this is only true for things in the world. I can't make a priori judgments that go beyond what could appear in time and space. So I can't judge a priori that there must be a god, or my soul must be immortal, or the afterlife must look like this or that. That doesn't work. Because here I would just throw my concepts around and combine them arbitrarily without knowing if they can be combined in this way, or if there really could be an object corresponding to this combination of concepts, to this representation I'm having. This also gives another proof for transcendental idealism. What exactly transcendental idealism is, I discussed in a previous lecture, but here you have another proof for it. Because if you believe that the things you are viewing around you, they are not just the things that appear to you, the phenomena, the sensibilia, but if you take them to be the intelligibilia, the noumena, the things in themselves, then you must become a skeptic. Because, as I have pointed out in previous lectures, we don't perceive connections. That was what Hume found, not in such general terms. He was just focused on one kind of connection, that is the connection of causality, but it is true for all kinds of connections. We don't perceive connections. I perceive one billiard ball rolling against the other, I perceive the other rolling away, but I don't perceive it rolling away because of the first. Connections are my thoughts. The 12 categories are the 12 kinds of connections that I make, that I give to the perceptions. Now, if what you perceive was the thing in itself, you would have no justification for applying your connections that are in your head to these things in themselves. We could say then maybe that we have to think in these 12 categories. And we can't help but applying these categories to our perceptions. So we can't help but looking at nature, for example, in terms of causality. But we could not say that this is the truth. We could always remain doubtful and say, maybe I can't help perceiving nature in that way, but maybe nature isn't really in that way. Maybe all these causal and other relations that I think are there aren't really there, and the actual nature is completely different. So in that way, transcendental realism, the belief to be dealing with the things in themselves, once you realize, based on Hume, that you don't perceive, you actually think connections, would have to lead you to complete skepticism in terms of these relations and connections. But if you go with Kant, and if you are a transcendental idealist, if you realize these things I perceive, they are not the things in themselves, they are the things as they affect me, as they appear to me. I'm not conscious of things, I'm conscious of my own representations of things. Then, of course, these connections between those things, between those representations that I think, they are not just the subjective connections I make, but they are objective. Not, of course, in terms of the object in itself, but in terms of the object that appears to me, the object of my perception. That object really is under these laws, for example, of causality. Because if it wasn't, I couldn't think it. So the whole point of the critique of pure reason and of the last few lectures I gave is this. The apperception, which got its own lecture, that is the act of uniting, synthesizing the various representations in my consciousness and saying they all belong to me, they are all my representations. There's always an I, a same subject that always stays the same when the representations change. This apperception is a condition of the possibility of experience. I couldn't make, as I explained in that other lecture, I couldn't make experience if it wasn't always me making that experience. I can only connect two perceptions and say that, for example, A caused B, the sun made the ice melt, if both perceptions are my perceptions. So I need to apperceive all representations as being mine. But this apperception, this act of synthesizing them, can only happen in 12 manners, according to the 12 forms of judgment we have. And therefore, it can only happen along the 12 categories we have. And that means, if this apperceiving, this synthesizing of our representations into one subject is necessary to even make experience, and if at the same time this apperception can only happen according to the 12 categories, then all experience has to conform to these 12 categories. And they are not just my subjective way of looking at the phenomena, but the phenomena really are under these rules. Because that is what a phenomenon is. It is my representation. It is in my consciousness. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a phenomenon, appearance, if it didn't appear to me. Then it would just be a thing in itself about which I can say nothing. And as a last point, with this, Kant has proven how pure natural science, that is metaphysical natural science a priori, without experience, is possible. Just like in the lecture on sensuality and space and time as forms of viewing, I explained how pure mathematics is possible, because we have these two forms of viewing, space and time, and we can therefore construct certain concepts in them a priori. I don't need to experience 100 triangles to know they will all have 180 degrees. I just need to come up with the concept of a triangle and construct it in pure space to know, okay, this triangle cannot be constructed in any other way with any other degrees than 180. Now, through the table of categories, we can say that there is a possibility for natural science a priori. So we don't have to first experience that there is, for example, causality in nature, or we don't have to first experience that it is always just accidents changing, never the substance. No substance can be created or destroyed as such. But rather, we can say this a priori. There are certain laws of nature that we can know a priori. But those are just very general laws, not the specific laws. So, for example, I know, okay, there must be causality. Nothing can happen in nature. I can never experience anything without a cause. But I don't know which specific cause will have which specific effect. So I can not know a priori that when things get heated, they will expand and not contract. That I need to find out through experience. Or I cannot know a priori, for example, that one of the substances in the world is gold, and gold has these accidents, like it can be a conductor of heat or of electricity, it can not rust or so on. But what I can know a priori is that when something does happen, so for example, when there is an expansion in an object, it must have a cause. I don't know if the cause is heat or cold a priori, but I do know a priori that there must be some cause. And likewise, I can know a priori that when there is a substance, I may not know a priori if the substance is gold or silver, or if it's hydrogen or whatever, and I don't know a priori what accidents it has, but I do know that when there is a substance, it must remain. It can be maybe split up, it can maybe change its accidents, but as a substance, it must remain. I do know a priori that the matter or the energy in the universe cannot become more or less. It can only change its form. And this is, once again, because I have this table of categories. I have these pure intellectual concepts that don't come out of nature, but that come out of my intellect, even though only while observing and experiencing nature, not just from birth. And my intellect can only think in these terms, and therefore everything that appears to me, therefore nature, must appear to me within these terms, within these concepts, within these laws. That is what Kant is saying in his critique of pure reason. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.